Hari Rama, Hari Rama, Rama Rama, Hari Hari, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama Rama, Hari Hari, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama Rama, Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama Rama, Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama Rama, Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama, Hari Hari, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama Rama, Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama Rama, Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Rama Rama, Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Krishna Krishna. Okay, just about time. Rama Rama, Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari. Anusha, Mohan Lal, Ananga Mohini, and everyone. Anna Shushakova, Rama Rama, Haribol, Haribol. Madhumati Sadhvi, Mandakini Bhaktivijay, Ishamanjari, Kinda Yoga, Children's Yoga. Okay, everyone, Haribol, Haribol. Rama, Rama, Hari Hari, Hari Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hari Hari, Hari Rama, Hari Rama. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Okay, devotees, Hare Krishna. We are continuing with Srila Prabhupada-lilamrita. And we're in the 10th chapter, which is titled, The Dream Come True. And as we were seeing last night, Srila Prabhupada, his situation is changing, slowly, but changing for the better. What's his name? Hanuman Prasad Poda, who was the chief of Gita Press, and like within the world of Hinduism, he was an extremely prominent, like, Hindu activist. Yeah, so he agreed to donate 4,000 rupees for the printing of Srimad Bhagavatam. So things are looking up. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharne Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschachadesha Tarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Pramanityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Okay, so just getting into the printing now. Our first printing of Srimad Bhagavatam. Indian printers do not always require full payment before they begin a job, provided they receive a substantial advance payment. After the job is printed and bound, a customer who has not made the complete payment takes a portion of books commensurate to what he has paid, and after selling those books, he uses his profit to buy more. Bhaktivedanta Swami estimated that printing one volume would cost 7,000 rupees, so he was 3,000 short. He raised a few hundred rupees more by going door to door throughout Delhi. Then he went back to Radha Press and asked Hitsaran Sharma to begin. Mr. Sharma agreed. Radha Press had already produced much of the first 2 chapters when Bhaktivedanta Swami objected that the type was not large enough. He wanted 12-point type, but the Radha Press had only 10-point. So Mr. Sharma agreed to take the work to another printer, Mr. Gautam Sharma of OK Press. In printing Bhaktivedanta Swami's Volume 1 of the first canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, OK Press printed 4 book pages twice on a side of 1 sheet of paper, 20 by 26 inches. But before running the full 1,100 copies, they would print a proof, which Bhaktivedanta Swami would read. Then, following the corrected proofs, the printers would correct the handset type and run a second proof, which Bhaktivedanta Swami would also read. Usually he would also find errors on the second proof. If so, they would print a third. If he found no errors on the third proof, they would then print the final pages. At this pace, Bhaktivedanta Swami was able to order small quantities of paper as he could afford it, from 6 to 10 reams at a time, ordered 2 weeks in advance. Even as the volume was being printed, he was still writing the last chapters. When the proofs were ready at OK Press, he would pick up the proofs, return to his room at Chippiwada, correct the proofs, and then return them. Sometimes 14-year-old Kant Vedi, who lived at the Chippiwada temple with his parents, would carry the proofs back and forth for the Swami. But in the last months of 1962, Bhaktivedanta Swami usually made a daily walk to OK Press. His walk through the tight, crowded lanes of Chippiwada soon led him to a road close to the Jama Mosque, and that road led into the noisy, heavily trafficked Chowri Bazaar. The neighborhood was a busy paper district. where laborers with ropes strapped across their shoulders pulled stout wooden carts heavily loaded with stacks of paper on small iron wheels. For 2 blocks, paper dealers were the only businesses. Hari Ram Gupta and Company, Roop Chand and Sons, Bengal Paper Mill Company Limited, Universal Traders, Janta Paper Mart, one after another, even down the side alleys. The neighborhood storefronts were colorful and disorderly. Pedestrian traffic was so hectic that for a person to dally, even for a moment, would cause a disruption. Carts and rickshaws carried paper and other goods back and forth through the streets. Sometimes a laborer would jog past with a hefty stack of pages on his head, the stack weighing down on either end. Traffic was swift, and an unmindful or slow-footed pedestrian risked being struck by a load protruding from the head of a bearer or from a passing cart. Occasionally, a man would be squatting on the roadside, smashing chunks of coal into small pieces to sell. Tiny corner smoke shops drew small gatherings of customers for cigarettes or pan. The shopkeeper would rapidly spread the pan spices on a betel leaf, and the customer would walk off down the street, chewing the pan and spitting out red-stained saliva. That's just amazing, yeah. How much have we seen that? Amidst this milieu, as the Chari Bazaar commercial district blended into tenement life, and children played in the hazardous streets, Bhaktivedanta Swami was a gentle-looking yet determined figure. As he walked past the tenements, the tile sellers, the grain sellers, the sweet shops, and the printers, overhead would be electric wires, pigeons, and the clotheslines from the tenement balconies. Finally, he would come to OK Press, directly across from a small mosque. He would come carrying the corrected proofs to anxiously oversee the printing work. After 4 months, when the whole book had been printed and the sheets were stacked on the floor of the press, Mr. Hatsaran Sharma arranged for the work to be moved to a bindery. The binding was done by an ancient operation, mostly by hand, and it took another month. Bhaktivedanta Swami would come and observe the workers. A row of men sat in a small room, surrounded by stacks of printed paper. The first man would take one of the large printed sheets, rapidly fold it twice, and pass it to the next man who performed the next operation. The pages would be folded, stitched, and collated, then put into a vise and hammered together before being trimmed on 3 sides with a handsaw and glued. Amazing. Bit by bit, the book would be prepared for the final hardcover. In addition to his visits to OK Press and the bindery, Bhaktivedanta Swami would also occasionally travel by bus across the Yamuna River to Mr. Hitsaran Sharma's Radha Press. The Radha Press was printing 1,000 dust jackets for the volume. Hitsaran Sharma. Swamiji was going hither and thither, He was getting whatever collections he could and depositing them. And he was always mixing with many people, going hither and thither. With me he was very fond that I should do everything as soon as possible. He had a great haste. He used to say, time is going, quick, do it. He would be annoyed with me also, and he would have me do his work first. But I was in the service of Dalmia, and I would tell him, your work has to be secondary for me. But he would say, now you have wasted my 2 days. What is this, Sharmaji? I'm coming here. I told you in the morning to do this, and you have not done it even now. But I would reply, I've got no time during the day. Then he would say, then you have wasted my complete day. So he was very much pressing me. This was his temperament. The binding was reddish, the color of an earthen brick, and was inlaid with gold lettering. Bhaktivedanta Swami had designed the dust jacket himself, and he had commissioned a young Bengali artist named Salit to execute it. It was a wraparound picture of the entire spiritual and material manifestations. Dominating the front cover was a pink lotus, and within its whirl were Radha and Krishna and their pastimes in Vrindavan, along with Lord Chaitanya chanting and dancing with his associates. From Krishna's lotus planet emanated yellow rays of light, and in that effulgence were many spiritual planets appearing like so many suns. Sitting within each planet was a different four-armed form of Narayan, each with his name lettered beneath the planet, Trivikram, Keshava, Purushottama, and so on. Within an oval at the bottom of the front cover, Mahavishnu was exhaling the material universes. On the inside cover was Bhaktivedanta Swami's explanation of the cover illustration. When the printing and binding were completed, there were 1,100 copies. Bhaktivedanta Swami would receive 100 copies, and the printer would keep the balance. From the sale of the 100 copies, Bhaktivedanta Swami would continue to pay off his debt to the printer and binder. Then he would receive another supply of books. This would continue until he had finished paying his debt. His plan was to then publish a second volume from the profits of the first, and a third volume from the profits of the second. Kant Vedi went to pick up the first 100 copies. He hired a man who put the books in large baskets, placed them on his hand truck, and then hauled them through the streets to the Chippiwada temple, where Bhaktivedanta Swami stacked them in his room on a bench. Bhaktivedanta Swami went out alone to sell his books and present them to important people. Dr. Radhakrishnan, who gave him a personal audience, agreed to read the book and write his opinion. Hanuman Prasad Poda was the first to write a favorable review. Quote, "It is a source of great pleasure for me that a long-cherished dream has materialized and is going to be materialized with this and the would-be publications. I thank the Lord that due to his grace, this publication could see the light." Unquote. Bhaktivedanta Swami went to the major libraries, universities, and schools in Delhi, where the librarians found him quote unquote, calm and quiet, noble, polite, scholarly, with a specific glow in him. Traveling on foot, he visited school administration offices throughout Delhi and placed copies in more than 40 schools in the Delhi area. The Ministry of Education, which had previously denied him assistance, placed an order for 50 copies for selected university and institutional libraries throughout India. The ministry paid him 600 rupees plus packing and postage charges, and Bhaktivedanta Swami mailed the books to the designated libraries. The US Embassy purchased 18 copies to be distributed in America through the Library of Congress. Prabhupada is just such a determined and amazing person. The institutional sales were brisk, but then sales slowed. As the only agent, Bhaktivedanta Swami was now spending hours just to sell a few copies. He was eager to print the second volume, yet until enough money came from the first, he could not print. In the meantime, he continued translating and writing purports. Writing so many volumes was a huge task that would take many years, and at his present rate, with sales so slow, he would not be able to complete the work in his lifetime. Although there were many who took part in the production of the book, and still others who became customers, only Bhaktivedanta Swami deeply experienced the successes and failures of the venture. It was his project, and he was responsible. No one was eager to see him writing prolifically, and no one demanded that it be printed. Even when the sales slowed to a trickle, the managers of OK Press were not distressed. They would give him the balance of his books only when he paid for them. And since it was also he who had the burden of hiring OK Press to print a second volume, the pressure was on him to go out and sell as many copies of the first volume as possible. For Hanuman Prasad Poda, the volume had been something to admire in passing. For Hitsaran Sharma, it had been something he attended to after his day's work for Mr. Dalmia. For the boy who lived at Chippiwada, the book had meant a few errands. For the paper dealers, it had meant a small order. For Dr. Radhakrishnan, it had been but the slightest, soon forgotten matter in a life crammed with national politics and Hindu philosophizing. But Bhaktivedanta Swami, by his full engagement in producing the Bhagavatam, felt bliss and assurance that Krishna was pleased. He did not, however, intend for the Bhagavatam to be his private affair. It was the sorely needed medicine for the ills of Kali Yuga, and it was not possible for only one man to administer it. Yet he was alone, and he felt exclusive pleasure and satisfaction in serving his Guru and Lord Krishna. Thus, his transcendental frustration and pleasure mingled, his will strengthened, and he continued alone. His spiritual master, the previous spiritual masters, and the Vedic scriptures all assured him that he was right. If a person got a copy of the Bhagavatam and read even one page, he might decide to take part in Lord Chaitanya's movement. If a person seriously read the book, he would be convinced about spiritual life. The more this book could be distributed, the more the people could understand Krishna consciousness. And if they understood Krishna consciousness, they would become liberated from all problems. Book selling was real preaching. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had wanted it, even at the neglect of constructing temples or making followers. Who could preach as well as Srimad Bhagavatam? Certainly, whoever spent 16 rupees for a book would also take the time at least to look at it. In the months that followed, Bhaktivedanta Swami received more favorable reviews. The prestigious Adya Library Bulletin gave a full review, noting, quote, the editor's vast and deep study of the subject, and concluding, further volumes of this publication are eagerly awaited, unquote. His scholarly godbrothers also wrote their appreciations. Swami Bon Maharaj, rector of the Institute of Oriental Philosophy in Vrindavan, wrote, quote, I have nothing but admiration for your bold and practical venture. If you should be able to complete the whole work, you will render a very great service to the cause of Prabhupada, Sri Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Goswami Maharaj, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and the country also. Do it, and rest assured there will be no scarcity of resources. Unquote. Bhakti Saranga Maharaj wrote a full review in his Sajjana Toshani. Quote, we expect that this particular English version of Srimad Bhagavatam will be widely read, and thereby spiritual poverty of people in general may be removed forever. At a time when we need it very greatly, Srimad Bhaktivedanta Swami has given us the right thing. We recommend this publication for everyone's serious study. Unquote. Sri Vishwanath Das, governor of Uttar Pradesh, commended the volume to all thoughtful people, and Economic Review praised the author for attempting a tremendous task. Quote, at a time when not only the people of India, but those of the West need the chastening quality of love and truth in the corrupting atmosphere of hate and hypocrisy, a work like this will have uplifting and corrective influence. Dr. Zakir Hussain, Vice President of India, wrote, quote, I have read your book, Srimad Bhagavatam, with great interest and much profit. I thank you again for the kind thought which must have prompted you to present it to me, unquote. The favorable reviews, although Bhaktivedanta Swami could not pay the printer with them, indicated a serious response. The book was valuable, and subsequent volumes would earn the series even more respect. By Krishna's grace, Bhaktivedanta Swami had already completed many of the translations and purports for Volume 2. Even in the last weeks of printing the first volume, he had been writing day and night for the second volume. It was glorification of the Supreme Lord, Krishna, and therefore it would require many, many volumes. He felt impelled to praise Krishna and describe him in more and more volumes. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had said that the presses of the world could not print fast enough the glories of Krishna and the spiritual world that were being received at every moment by pure devotees. Bhaktivedanta Swami decided to return to Vrindavan for several months of intensive writing on Volume 2. This was his real business at Radha Damodar Temple. Vrindavan was the best place for writing transcendental literature. That had already been demonstrated by the Vaishnava acharyas of the past. Living in simple ease, taking little rest and food, he continually translated the verses and composed his Bhaktivedanta purports for Volume 2. After a few months, after amassing enough manuscript pages, he would return to Delhi and once again enter the world of publishing. In Volume 1, he had covered the first 6.5 chapters of the first canto. The second volume began on page 365 with the 8th verse of the 7th chapter. Bhaktivedanta Swami wrote in his purport that the Srimad Bhagavatam was meant for Paramahamsas, persons engaged purely in self-realization. Yet, he wrote, it works into the depth of the heart of those who may be worldly men. Worldly men are all engaged in the matter of sense gratification, but even such men also will find in this Vedic literature a remedial measure for their material diseases. Bhaktivedanta Swami returned to Delhi to raise funds for printing Volume 2. When he visited a prospective donor, he would show the man Volume 1 and the growing collection of reviews, explaining that he was asking a donation not to support himself, but to print this important literature. Although for the first volume he had received no donations equal to the 4,000 rupees he had received from Mr. Podar, an executive in the L&H sugar factory gave a donation of 5,000 rupees for Volume 2. Wow. Bhaktivedanta Swami had been dissatisfied with Hitsaran Sharma as a production supervisor. Although supposedly an expert in the trade, Hitsaran had caused delays, and sometimes he had advised Gautam Sharma without consulting Bhaktivedanta Swami. The work on Volume 1 had slowed and even stopped when a job from a cash customer had come up, and Bhaktivedanta Swami had complained that it was Hitsaran's fault for not giving money to OK Press on time. For Volume 2, Bhaktivedanta Swami decided to deal directly with OK Press and supervise the printing himself. He spoke to Gautam Sharma and offered a partial payment. Although the majority of the copies of Volume 1 were still standing on their printing floor, Bhaktivedanta Swami wanted OK Press to begin Volume 2. Gautam Sharma accepted the job. Wow. It was early in 1964 when Volume 2 went to press, following the same steps as Volume 1. But this time Bhaktivedanta Swami was more actively present, pushing. To avoid delays, he purchased the paper himself. At Sidho Mal and Sons Paper Merchants, in the heart of the paper district, he would choose and order his paper and then arrange to transport it to OK Press. If the order was a large one, he would have it carried by cart. Smaller orders he would send by rickshaw or on the head of a bearer. In his preface to the second volume, Bhaktivedanta Swami expressed the apparent oddity of working in Delhi while living in Vrindavan. Quote, "The path of fruitive activities, that is to say, the path of earn money and enjoy life, as it is going on generally, appears to have become also our profession, although we have renounced the order of worldly life. They see that we are moving in the cities, in the government offices, banks, and other business places for promoting the publication of Srimad Bhagavatam. They also see that we're moving in the press, paper market, and amongst the bookbinders, also away from our residence at Vrindavan. And thus they conclude sometimes mistakenly that we're also doing the same business in the dress of a mendicant. But actually, there's a gulf of difference between the two kinds of activities. This is not a business for maintaining an establishment of material enjoyment. On the contrary, it is a humble attempt to broadcast the glories of the Lord at a time when the people need it very badly." Unquote. He went on to describe how in former days, even 50 years ago, well-to-do members of society had commissioned pundits to print or handwrite the Bhagavatam and then distribute copies amongst the devotees and the general people. But times had changed. Quote, "At the present moment, the time is so changed that we had to request one of the biggest industrialists of India to purchase 100 copies and distribute them, but the poor fellow expressed his inability." Krishna. "We wish that someone may come forward to pay for the actual cost of publication of the Srimad Bhagavatam, and then let them be distributed free to all the leading gentlemen of the world. But nobody is so far prepared to do this social, uplifting work." Unquote. After thanking the Ministry of Education and the Director of Education for distributing copies to institutions and libraries, Bhaktivedanta Swami again stated his predicament before his reading public. Quote, "The problem is that we must get some money for completing the work, which is admittedly a mighty project. The sales proceeds are being employed in the promotional work and not in sense gratification. Herein lies the difference from the fruit of activities. And for all this, we have to approach everyone concerned just like a businessman. There's no harm to become a businessman if it's done on account of the Lord, as much as there was no harm to become a violent warrior like Arjuna or Hanumanji, if such belligerent activities are executed to satisfy the desires of the Supreme Lord. So even though we're not in the Himalayas, even though we talk of business, even though we deal in rupees and paisa, still, simply because we're 100% servants of the Lord and are engaged in the service of broadcasting the message of His glories, certainly we shall transcend and get through the invincible impasse of Maya and reach the effulgent kingdom of God to render Him face-to-face eternal service in full bliss and knowledge. We are confident of this factual position, and we may also assure to our numerous readers that they will also achieve the same result simply by hearing the glories of the Lord." Unquote. On receipt of the first copies of the second volume, another 400-page, cloth-bound, brick-colored Srimad Bhagavatam with the same dust jacket as Volume 1, Bhaktivedanta Swami made the rounds of the institutions, scholars, politicians, and booksellers. One Delhi bookseller, Dr. Manohar Lal Jain, had particular success in selling the volumes. Manohar Lal Jain. He would come to me for selling his books. He would come often, and he used to chat with me for 1 or 2 hours. He had no other business except selling his books as much as possible. We would discuss the difficulties he was having and also many other things, yoga, Vedanta, and religious aspects of life. His problem was distributing his work because it was a big publication. He had planned to publish it in many volumes. Naturally, I told him it was not possible for any individual bookseller or publisher here to publish it and invest money in it. So that was a little bit of a disappointment for him because he could not bring out more volumes. But my sales were good because this was the best translation, Sanskrit text with English translations. No other such edition was available. I sold about 150 to 200 copies in about 2 or 3 years. The price was very little, only 16 rupees. He had published his reviews, and he had a good sell, a good market. The price was reasonable, and he was not interested in making money out of it. He was printing in English for the foreigners. He had a good command of Sanskrit as well as English. When we met, we would speak in English, and his English was very impressive. He wanted me to publish, but I didn't have any presses and no finances. I told him frankly I would not be able to publish it because it was not 1 or 2 volumes, but many. But he managed anyhow. I referred him to Atmaram and Sons. He also used to go there. He was a great master, a philosopher, a great scholar. I used to enjoy the talks. He used to sit with me for 1 or 2 hours, as much as he could afford. Sometimes he'd come in the morning, 11 or 12, and then sometimes in the afternoon. He used to come in for money. How many copies are sold? So I would pay him. Practically, he was not doing very well with finances at that time. He only wanted that his book should be sold to every library and everywhere where the people are interested in it. We used to publish a catalog every month, and I would advertise his book. Orders would be coming from all over the world, so at least for me, the sales were picking up. If I sold 100 copies of the first volume, then I figured the second volume should be sold in the same number, naturally. But definitely those who would take the first volume would also take volume 2, because it was institutional, and the institutions will always try to complete their set. He used to discuss with me how the volumes can be brought out and how many it would take to complete the Srimad Bhagavatam. He was very much interested in bringing out the whole series." Unquote. In January of 1964, Bhaktivedanta Swami was granted an interview with Indian Vice President Zakir Hussain, who, although a Muslim, had written an appreciation of Bhaktivedanta Swami's Srimad Bhagavatam. As Dr. Hussain cordially received the author at the presidential palace, Bhaktivedanta Swami spoke of the importance of Srimad Bhagavatam in the cause of love of Godhead. But Dr. Hussain wanted to know how love of Godhead could help humanity. The question put by ruler to sadhu was filled with philosophical implications. But the vice president's busy schedule of meetings did not permit Bhaktivedanta Swami to answer fully. For the vice president, the interview was a gesture of appreciation, recognizing the Swami for his work on behalf of India's Hindu cultural heritage. And Bhaktivedanta Swami humbly accepted the ritual. Later, however, he wrote Dr. Hussain a long letter answering the question he had not had time to answer during their brief meeting. Quote, Muslims also admit that there is nothing greater than Allah. The Christians also admit that God is great. The human society must learn to obey the laws of God. He reminded Dr. Hussain of India's great cultural asset, the Vedic literature. The Indian government could perform the best welfare work for humanity by disseminating Vedic knowledge in a systematic way. Srimad Bhagavatam was, quote unquote, produced in India. It was the substantial contribution India could offer to the world. In March of 1964, Krishna Pandit, Bhaktivedanta Swami's sponsor at the Radha Krishna temple in Chippiwada, arranged for him to reside for a few months. Wow. At the Sri Radha Vallabhaji temple in the nearby Rosanpur Naisarik neighborhood. There he could continue his writing and publishing, but he would also be giving a series of lectures. Krishna Pandit provided Bhaktivedanta Swami about 1,500 rupees for his maintenance. On Bhaktivedanta Swami's arrival at Sri Radha Vallabhaji temple, the manager distributed notices inviting people to, quote, take full advantage of the presence of a Vaishnav sadhu as, quote unquote, resident acharya. Bhaktivedanta Swami held morning and evening discourses at the temple without reducing his activities of writing and printing. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Okay. What was that?
They have the lawnmower to mow the grass.
I see. Should be careful not to sit on the new grass, not to sit, if the thing can be set on different heights, not to set it too low.
On the new grass.
Yeah, because it may start smashing it.